Sometimes power doesn't come with noise. It doesn't shout, it doesn't fight, it doesn't beg. It simply sits, calm and prepared, until the world realizes too late who it was underestimating. This is the story of Dr. Naomi Brooks, a Black CEO whose quiet strength turned a humiliating moment at 30,000 feet into one of the most expensive lessons an airline ever faced. You're watching Simply Stories, where truth meets power. The cabin air was crisp, the kind of recycled chill that made every movement sharper, every word heavier. Dr. Naomi Brooks stood at the entrance of first class, boarding pass in hand, her blazer pressed, suitcase rolling quietly at her side. She was a picture of calm, her presence composed and unshaken. Yet, before she could take her seat, a voice cut through the moment. "You people always try something," said flight attendant Samantha Barnes, tilting her head with a tight-lipped smile. The words were dropped like trash onto polished marble, casual enough to sound harmless, sharp enough to wound, and just... As the sting settled, Samantha leaned closer, her eyes narrowing, and added with a smirk, "You don't look like a doctor. You look like you belong in Coach." A ripple ran through the cabin. Not a laugh, not a shout, but something worse. Whispers. Phones slid out of pockets. Faces turned, eyes flicked. Judgment hung in the air like turbulence no one could see but everyone could feel. Naomi did not blink. She did not flinch, protest, or explain. She simply extended her boarding pass again, her name printed in black and white. Dr. Naomi Brooks, Seat 2A, First Class. Samantha took it with exaggerated doubt, raising it toward the light as if the paper itself might confess fraud. Then, dismissing the truth she already held, she shoved it back against Naomi's chest. The crowd stirred. Some leaned closer, pretending not to listen. Others tilted their phones, recording from sly angles, chasing drama instead of clarity. A businessman muttered to his neighbor, "She probably snuck up here. Watch, she's going to cry discrimination." Another voice added, "Guarantee that bag's fake. They always try to act rich." Prejudice didn't march in loudly. It spread in murmurs, in quiet agreement, in the silence of those who knew better but chose not to speak. Naomi, however, remained unshaken. She slipped her phone from her pocket, her fingers moving with precision. 3 quick messages, no wasted words, one to her assistant, one to legal, one to a number labeled Board Chair Personal. Then she slid the phone back into her coat, as if she had merely checked the weather. Her calmness unsettled the moment more than outrage could. While others expected an argument or tears, she offered none. Power doesn't always fight back. Sometimes it waits. But Samantha wasn't waiting. She turned slightly, angling her phone toward herself, pressing "Go Live." "Hey, fam," she grinned into the camera, her voice rising. "You won't believe what's happening today." She tilted the camera toward Naomi without saying her name, letting implication do the work. "Some folks think they can sit wherever they want, no matter what their ticket says." Within minutes, the viewer count ticked upward, 18, 300, then thousands more. Strangers scrolling on their screens were now spectators in a performance staged on prejudice, and in row 1, another passenger joined in, raising his phone and captioning his video. Flight fraud in real time. Let's see how this plays out. Assumptions spread faster than the aircraft ever could. Comments poured into live feeds. "She's faking it." "Classic victim play." "Watch." Her scream racism. Not one of these strangers had seen her boarding pass. Not one had paused to question the story. The truth had become irrelevant, replaced by the comfort of a familiar lie. Naomi knew it, and yet she sat down in 2A with the same grace she carried. When she boarded, she crossed her legs, smoothed her blazer, and waited. Her silence was not surrender. It was strategy. The cabin had transformed into something more than rows of seats. It had become a stage, a courtroom, a pressure chamber where bias and dignity collided. Every passenger, whether they whispered, recorded, or looked away, had taken a side. Silence itself carried a volume. The young woman in row 3 kept her eyes on her Kindle, but her trembling hands betrayed her fear. The retired firefighter in row 4 clenched his jaw, his gaze locked on Samantha. And yet, most said nothing. That was how bias thrived, through the quiet of those who let it. Naomi did not push back against the current. She simply held her ground, her stillness louder than their noise. In a room hungry for spectacle, she gave them nothing but presence, because she understood something the cabin didn't yet know, that real power doesn't panic, doesn't plead, doesn't rush to prove itself. It waits, quietly, until the moment reveals who was right all along. And as the murmurs grew louder, as the live streams multiplied, as strangers laughed and judged, Naomi Brooks sat in seat 2A, patient as stone, knowing that in just a few minutes the same people who underestimated her would witness a storm unlike any they had ever seen. The air inside the cabin tightened when 2 uniformed security officers stepped aboard. Their presence brought a hush over first class, the kind of silence that came not from respect, but from expectation. Officer Daniels, broad-shouldered and rigid, moved directly toward seat 2A, his tone sharp, his assumption already written in, his posture. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "you need to come with us. This seat isn't yours, and you're disrupting the flight." Behind him, Samantha folded her arms, her lips curled with satisfaction as if she had won a battle before it even began. She leaned toward the officers and added, "She refused to move when I asked. She's been hostile since boarding." The lie dripped easily, and the murmurs began again, passengers whispering, some nodding along as if her words confirmed what they already wanted to believe. Phones rose higher now, cameras glowing like watchful eyes, eager for a confrontation. Naomi did not flinch. She lifted her gaze to Officer Daniels, her voice calm, measured, each word weighted with precision. "Officer, I am seated where my ticket places me. Row 2A, first class." Her hand moved smoothly to her purse, where she retrieved 3 items with deliberate grace. A platinum frequent flyer card, a polished business card that bore her name, Dr. Naomi Brooks, CEO of Orion Dynamics, and the boarding pass itself, crisp and undeniable. She held them out, not pleading, not performing, but presenting facts like stone tablets carved in truth. Daniels hesitated, looking from the documents to her face, and for a fraction of a second his certainty wavered. Before he could speak, the cabin door opened again, and the man who entered shifted the air itself. Captain Robert Shaw, tall and commanding in his Navy uniform, stepped forward. His presence drew attention not just because of authority, but because of the quiet respect it carried. Samantha straightened immediately, her confidence faltering for the first time. "Captain," she began, gesturing toward Naomi, "this passenger is refusing to comply." But Shaw's eyes had already fallen on the boarding pass in Naomi's hand, and then on the name written across it. His brow lifted. "Dr. Naomi Brooks?" he asked, his tone not skeptical but surprised. Naomi inclined her head slightly, neither apologizing nor explaining. The captain's expression shifted again, this time to recognition. "Orion Dynamics," he said under his breath, but the words carried. The passengers closest to the front row heard them, and the ripple began. Orion Dynamics, the company that designed and supplied systems for the very aircraft they were sitting in, the company that kept fleets in the air worldwide. And the woman sitting silently in 2A was not just a doctor, not just a CEO, but the mind behind one of aviation's strongest players. The balance in the cabin tilted, as if gravity itself had shifted. The retired firefighter in row 4, who had clenched his jaw earlier, finally spoke up. "I saw her boarding pass. She was calm the whole time. She didn't do a thing wrong." Maria Santos, a young woman in row 3 who had been silently, Clutching her Kindle, raised her voice too. "She's been harassed since she walked in. None of this is right." Their words broke through the murmurs, but still, others doubled down. A man in the aisle seat muttered, "So, what if she's rich? Doesn't mean she didn't lie." Another added, "They're probably covering for her now." Even in the face of truth, bias fought to survive. Captain Shaw's patience was thin. He raised his hand, silencing the noise. "I've verified the booking. Dr. Brooks has a first-class ticket, purchased in full. She is exactly where she belongs." His words cut sharp, undeniable. For the first time, Samantha's face paled, her performance unraveling as the cameras that had once cheered her now turned in silent judgment. But outside the plane, the story had already escaped. Samantha's live stream had done more than embarrass. It had handed Naomi's name to the world. And now, on TikTok feeds and Twitter threads, on Reddit forums and aviation blogs, the identity of the calm woman in 2A was spreading like wildfire. Screens filled with posts. "That's Dr. Naomi Brooks. She literally builds the planes they're flying on." "Orion Dynamics. She owns the company that supplies this airline." Videos of her silence, her composure, her dignity against the storm of accusation were already trending. Naomi didn't scroll. She didn't glance at her phone. She didn't need to. The truth had found its wings without her lifting a finger. While lies spread fast, truth had a way of catching up, and when it did, it carried more weight, more force, more permanence. In the cabin, eyes shifted uncomfortably. Passengers who had whispered accusations now avoided her gaze. Phones that had recorded mockery now shook in reluctant hands, their owners realizing they had filmed their own shame. Naomi sat still, her spine straight, her gaze forward. She did not gloat, did not smirk, did not remind them of the insults. She had endured. She simply existed, the embodiment of unshaken dignity, because she understood what few around her did, that power does not always roar. Sometimes it waits in silence until truth itself speaks louder than any defense ever could. And in that silence, she had already won. The cabin was still vibrating from the captain's announcement when Naomi finally moved. Until now, she had remained a silent anchor in a storm of accusations. But the time had come for clarity that would leave no space for doubt. She rose slowly, not in defiance but with the calm certainty of someone who knew the weight of her own presence. Her voice carried low but steady, enough for every ear in the cabin to catch. "I am Naomi Brooks, CEO of Orion Dynamics, but that is not the only role I hold. Through Vanguard Capital, the investment group I chair, I hold 12% equity in your parent company." Her words fell like stones into still water. 12%. Not a customer, not just a supplier, but an owner. For a moment, the plane itself seemed to exhale. Samantha's smirk shattered into silence, her posture collapsing under the enormity of what had just been revealed. Phones that had been lifted to record for entertainment now trembled as their owners realized they were filming history and their own complicity. Captain Shaw froze, his jaw tightening as the implications sank in. This was no longer a question of a disputed seat or even of passenger mistreatment. This was a corporate crisis unfolding in real time, one that could shake the airline from its foundations. He cleared his throat, adjusting his hat as if the uniform itself felt heavier. "Dr. Brooks," he said carefully, "I understand now. I assure you the airline will take full responsibility for this misconduct." His words were formal, respectful, but behind them lay the awareness that every decision made in the next few hours would be scrutinized by investors, shareholders, and the public. The passengers, who had once been an audience of whispers and judgment, began to break apart into individuals with voices of their own. The businessman who had loudly accused her earlier leaned forward, his face flushed with regret. "I spoke out of turn," he stammered. "I let my assumptions guide. Me, that was wrong." His apology carried no defense, only the heavy shame of realizing he had stood on the wrong side of truth. A young woman with trembling hands raised her voice next, her eyes shining with tears. "I wanted to say something," she admitted, "but I was afraid. I stayed quiet, and I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." Her words cracked open a truth deeper than Naomi's revelations, the silent complicity that allowed bias to fester unchecked. And then, from row 4, the retired firefighter spoke again, his voice grounded, steady like the strike of a bell. "Accountability matters," he said firmly. "Today, it starts right here, with all of us." Through it all, Naomi stood not as an avenger, but as a leader. She did not scold, did not raise her voice, did not allow bitterness to dictate her words. Instead, she set forth measures with the clarity of a boardroom decision. "Effective, immediately," she said evenly. "Any staff member who live-streamed or encouraged this spectacle will face termination. Those directly involved will be suspended pending full investigation. A formal apology will be issued to passengers and to the public by the corporate board." Each point was delivered with precision, not as revenge but as correction, a roadmap to restore dignity to a process that had stripped it away. The authority in her tone was undeniable, yet it carried no malice. She was not interested in humiliation, she was interested in change. Samantha, pale and trembling, looked as though the ground beneath her had opened. The certainty she had flaunted so boldly now drained away, replaced by the realization that she was no longer in control of the story. She had become its cautionary tale. Her silence was louder than her earlier accusations, her downfall etched, not by Naomi's anger but by Naomi's restraint. Officer Daniel shifted uncomfortably too, his earlier confidence shrinking beneath the weight of his own misjudgment. The power that once seemed firmly in his grasp had dissolved into something far greater, accountability he could not escape. The cabin, once divided, now began to settle into reflection. Some passengers lowered their phones, ashamed of what they had captured. Others turned inward, faces haunted by the recognition of how quickly they had believed the worst about a woman whose only crime was existing where they did not expect her to belong. The truth had dismantled their bias, not with force, but with the steady strength of dignity. Naomi's silence had not been weakness, it had been strategy, and now her words were not weapons, but instruments of change. The narrator's voice stretched over the scene like a shadow. Quiet strength had shifted the course of the day, dismantling prejudice without a single raised tone. It was not rage that had brought the room to its knees, but dignity. Naomi Brooks had shown them that power is not in shouting, not in spectacle, but in the calm that comes when one knows the truth needs no defense. What had begun as whispers of suspicion had ended as echoes of accountability. And in that moment, aboard that aircraft high above the world, prejudice had been stripped of its mask, not by force, but by grace. The storm inside the aircraft had broken, but Naomi Brooks was not finished. She had no interest in leaving this moment as a cautionary tale or a trending scandal on social media. Instead, she rose once more, not to defend herself, but to plant the seeds of reform. Her voice, steady and deliberate, filled the cabin. What happened here today is not just about one seat, one misunderstanding, or one woman. It is about a system that allows bias to become procedure, assumption to become judgment, and silence to become complicity. That must change, and it will. She unfolded what she called the Airfare Initiative, a blueprint for structural reform that would reach beyond this single flight. The first step, she explained, would be mandatory bias training for all airline employees, not as a box to check, but as a core measure of professionalism. No one should be treated as an intruder in a space they rightfully belong, she said, firmly. Next, she outlined the creation of strict verification protocols, where facts, not assumptions, would guide decisions. If a dispute arose, staff would be trained to check records before escalating confrontations. Then came her third point, a passenger advocacy hotline, a direct channel for travelers to report mistreatment without fear of dismissal. And finally, she proposed public diversity reporting, forcing airlines to disclose how they train, hire, and treat their people. Transparency, she explained, was the only way to build trust. Around her, the passengers who had once been so quick to judge now leaned forward, listening with the gravity of students before a teacher. Maria Santos, the quiet observer with her phone, lifted it again. But this time, she was not documenting humiliation. She was capturing history. Her lens recorded the transformation of a cabin that had once been divided by suspicion, now united in reflection. A businessman who earlier mocked Naomi nodded solemnly, his earlier arrogance washed away by the clarity of her words. The young woman who had admitted her silence now mouthed, "Thank you," as though she, too, had been given a chance to reclaim her voice. Even Officer Daniels sat stiff in his seat, unable to deny that this moment had already traveled beyond him, beyond the cabin, into the world. Naomi's voice did not tremble. It carried the weight of responsibility, not resentment. "Change," she said, "doesn't begin when someone gets caught. It begins when someone chooses to see what they ignored. Every person in this room has a choice. Today, tomorrow, every day after. Will you look away or will you act?" Her words struck not just the passengers but the unseen audience outside, the thousands online who had already begun sharing her name, her face, her calm dismantling of injustice. They were not watching a victim or even a CEO. They were watching a leader reshape the narrative of what power looks like. The plane, delayed for far too long, finally prepared for departure. As the engines hummed to life, there was a noticeable stillness in the cabin. Not awkward silence, but the silence that comes after revelation, when no one dares to speak too quickly for fear of breaking the weight of the moment. Naomi returned to her seat in 2A, not with triumph but with quiet strength. She fastened her seatbelt, opened a simple leather notebook, and began to write, as though she had not just changed the course of an airline but was already building the next chapter of reform. Around her, passengers shifted in their seats, glancing her way, not out of curiosity, but with newfound respect. For them, she was no longer just a passenger. She was the living embodiment of what it meant to turn humiliation into transformation. The narrator's voice cut through the hum of the engines, weaving the lesson into something larger. Power, it said, does not need to announce itself with volume or fury. Real power prepares, builds, waits, and when it is rooted in truth, it cannot be stopped. Naomi Brooks had not shouted, had not demanded, had not crumbled. She had held her silence until the silence itself became unbearable, and then she had spoken, not for revenge, but for reform. In doing so, she had reminded everyone in that cabin, and everyone watching beyond it, that dignity does not bow to bias, and truth does not need to raise its voice. As the aircraft lifted into the night sky, the cabin lights dimmed, leaving a sense of closure behind. The scandal that had threatened to define the day was already dissolving, replaced by the blueprint of a future where such scandals would not be possible. Maria Santos lowered her phone at last, her recording complete, her eyes wet with quiet pride. Naomi leaned back in her seat, the weight of the world on her shoulders, but carried with ease by the certainty that she had not wasted her platform. She had turned injustice into instruction, pain into progress. And so, as the plane soared, so too did the story, destined to outlive the flight itself. For those who heard it, for those who lived it, the lesson would remain. Silence is not surrender. Composure is not weakness, and truth, when spoken at the right moment, becomes unstoppable. If this story moved you, share it, And for more stories of truth, power, and dignity, subscribe to Simply Stories, where we don't just tell stories, we raise the standard.